What's up guys, thanks for checking out the video. In today's video, I'm going to walk you guys through the final steps of pulling your Subaru motor out of your vehicle. This video is the end of a build series where I've walked through every single step in preparing this motor to get pulled out. And in today's video, we're finally pulling this sucker out. I hope you enjoy the video, I hope you enjoy the build series. Thanks so much for checking it out. I'm Luke, this is the SubaruONLY Show. This is my little SubaruONLY shop. It's a DIY Subaru channel. It's a channel where all I do is Subaru builds and race Subaru vehicles in motorsport events. It's a DIY themed channel where I walk you guys through the steps to get your Subarus back on the road and hopefully do a little racing of your own. So thanks for checking out the video guys. I really appreciate it. This video is actually part of a build series where I'm removing a 2005 WRX engine and tranny from my 1998 two-door coupe. This whiteboard behind me has the 16 steps that I've been going through as I make these videos on this build series. Here's a close-up view of the list, and I put a hash mark by each step we've completed. As you can see, we've worked our way down the list, and we're all the way down here on the final steps. Step 14, 15, and 16, connecting the engine lift and crane, lifting the engine and transmission, and supporting the transmission, and then remove the final bolt and remove the engine. There's actually one bolt. I'll erase that right now. Let me get that erased, boom. And I'm gonna do all three of those steps in this video. So this video will actually be the last video in this build series where I'm removing this engine from that 1998 Impreza two-door coupe. And the steps that I've walked through in these videos where I'm removing this 2005 WRX engine will actually apply to virtually any Subaru engine that you're gonna remove from your Subaru. Doesn't matter if it's naturally aspirated or turbocharged, 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder. I'll bet that 95% of these steps will actually apply to you and your engine combination as well. So I hope you found this build series valuable, and check out some of those older videos if you want to see some of those earlier steps. Okay, so let's head out to the car and let's take a look at the tools I'll be using to pull this engine. Alright, here's the engine hoist that I use. It's Pittsburgh model. You basically can get it at any Harbor Freight store. I'll walk you guys through how I set it up. It definitely helped get one of these engine leveling blocks. They have a little crank on one side. The way these suckers work is as you crank it, it actually moves that mounting point along that block. So definitely get yourself one of these leveling blocks. It makes it a hell of a lot easier to pull any engine. I actually get 4 of these suckers to connect my chains to that leveling block. These little suckers are rated for 2,200 pounds each, and they have a little screwing lock mechanism that you can lock down so you make sure the sucker's not going to come off. Okay, the next thing are the engine chains you're going to use. Most engine hoist chains that you get are going to come with these little right angle brackets. And these work great if you can connect directly to your engine block, or in some cases to your intake manifold. I've done both, and I'll walk you guys through that in a little bit more detail later in the video. But for now, I'm just going to walk you through how I connect them to my leveling block. Now, in addition to these engine hoist chains, I actually use these heavy duty cam locks. These suckers are awesome. They're made of stainless steel. They have spring-loaded little latches right there, and they're rated for 800 pounds each. So each one of these could lift an entire engine. And actually use these guys to connect to our lift points on the engine. So for now, I'll put these on the chain, and we'll throw these suckers on the leveling block on the engine hoist until we're ready to connect it to the engine. Then you can go ahead and screw that sucker down and lock it in place. You can see how quick and easy it's going to be to connect this to the engine once we're all set up. Okay guys, that's my whole engine hoist setup. It's a quick and easy setup. I hope you fucking lawnmower engine or leaf blower like crazy. How much more you gotta do out there, bro? You're like, full steam yet. Okay, so that's the whole engine hoist or engine crane setup. You got your hoist. Make sure you extend that top arm out to the furthest point. That makes it a lot easier. You got your leveling block. That definitely makes it a lot easier because you're gonna need to tilt that sucker a little bit as you're pulling the engine out. Then you got your chains, and of course I'm using these quick release heavy duty carabiners. You can use any hardware to connect to that engine, but just make sure it's rated for the weight of these engines. These engines are typically in the 400 to 500 pound range. And if you're gonna pull your engine and your tranny, add a few hundred more pounds to that estimate. Okay, so let's move on to connecting this sucker to the engine. Okay, we're over the engine bay, and we're getting ready to set this chain up. Now where are our engine mounting points? The two mounting points are this bracket in the back of the engine, right here, that bolts up right next to the bell housing. And the second mounting point is gonna be that AC compressor bracket. That's that heavy duty cast bracket, and it's got that hole right here that's gonna be perfect to lift this engine from. Okay, that's our first 2 points connected to the front of the engine. Now we'll move on to the back of the engine. Now I'm going to go ahead and lift the hoist and take the slack out of those chains. And as I do that, I'm going to make sure everything's lined up correctly and not binding up, because it's pretty common and pretty easy for these things to bind up as they're starting to tighten up. Okay, now the chains are tight, and I can make any final adjustments before I start pulling this engine out. Okay, as you can see, the chains are now hooked up. This hoist is completely hooked up to the engine, and we're ready to pull this sucker out. But before we go any further, I want to talk about the angles that this engine should be pulled out, because this engine is actually connected to that input shaft of your tranny. And that tranny and that input shaft are aligned on a certain horizontal plane that you actually need to consider when you're pulling this engine out, because you actually need to slide the engine out off that input shaft, and you need to pull the engine up and out of those engine mount studs. You need to make sure both those things happen at the right angles so you can get this engine out. And I've actually put a little drawing on the whiteboard inside where I walk through that. Okay, here's a little drawing that I put up on the whiteboard for the engine removal process. And on the left here, you'll see I actually have 3 different scenarios: scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. In scenario 1, the front of the car is lifted up, but the rear of the car is sitting down. So the car is at an upward angle. In scenario 2, both the front tires and the rear tires are on the flat surface, so the car is sitting totally flat and horizontal. And in scenario 3, the rear end of the car is actually lifted up more than the front of the car, so the car is actually lifted up but at a downward angle. And then in addition to all these cars that are lifted at these different angles, I actually have the hoist drawn over here to the right. And that hoist is actually going to have the same angle for all 3 scenarios. And in addition to that hoist arm, you actually have the hoist chain, and that hoist chain and that arm will actually determine the angle that that hoist is going to pull that engine out. And like I mentioned earlier, the hoist arm angle and that chain and the angle that's going to pull the engine out actually won't change between scenario 1, 2, or 3. The only thing that does change is the angle that you have the car raised or lowered at. You can make this whole process a lot easier if you consider what angle your car is lifted at when you connect this hoist and you start moving this engine. And the reason that's important is because of this drawing that I've shown over here on the right half of this whiteboard. Here, I'm showing the engine as a simplified block drawing, and I'm calling out the location for that transmission input shaft. And then down below, I'm also calling out the location for the engine mount studs. And I'm calling those 2 locations out because when we remove this engine, those are the 2 things that we're going to have to be thinking about. We're going to have to lift the engine up so that those studs are free from the front cross member. And then, after the studs are clear, we're going to have to go ahead and slide that engine off of the transmission input shaft. And what I've underlined and starred here on the bottom is angles, because this process is all about the angles that we're working at. And that's why I've drawn the cars over here in 3 different scenarios at different angles, because the angle that the car is sitting at is going to be a pretty good idea of what the angle that that input shaft is sitting at. So in scenario 1, that input shaft will probably be sitting at an upward angle. In scenario 2, the input shaft will be sitting relatively flat, and in scenario 2, the input shaft will be sliding slightly downwards. So I suggest anytime you're going to remove one of these engines, you set your car up with an angle in scenario 2 or scenario 3, because it makes it a hell of a lot easier to slide that engine off that input shaft and up and out of that car. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set my car up closer to scenario 2 or 3. Okay, we're all hooked up. The hoist is hooked up to the engine. The back of the car is jacked up, so the car is actually slanting slightly downwards on the nose side, which makes the angle for that input shaft that's going into the engine a little bit more favorable when we pull this engine out. As you can see, the back is actually jacked up higher than the front. So we're ready to go ahead and lift this engine up, support the transmission, remove that last bolt, and then pull the engine out. Okay, let's go ahead and get this sucker done. So go ahead and jack this sucker up a little bit. Okay, I just checked and we've actually cleared that front cross member with those lower engine mount studs. So the next step to do is to actually support that transmission. That way we can remove that last bolt, we can pull that engine off of that transmission input shaft and pull it up and out of the engine bay. This sucker's good to go, so we can move on to the next step, remove that bolt, and then get this engine slid off that input shaft. Okay, here's that last bolt that we left in as a safety precaution. That way this engine and this tranny don't separate before we get it all up and ready to pull out. Now that the engine's lifted up, we've cleared those studs, and the transmission is supported from underneath, we can go ahead and remove this bolt. Okay, now this engine should be ready to be separated from this transmission. I'm going to go ahead and lift it up slightly and try to separate it from that transmission surface. But I'm going to let you guys know, a lot of the times, the transmission bell housing surface and the rear of the engine get completely seized together because of road debris and salt and weathering that takes place back here. And when that's the case, these guys can be a real bitch to separate. But even when that happens, you can actually use a big screwdriver and hammer and get these suckers separated. So I'm going to go ahead and start to separate this engine, and we're going to see how hard it is. Okay, this sucker is totally stuck, so I'm going to grab a big ass screwdriver and a sledgehammer. I'm going to show you guys where I'm going to hammer on this sucker to separate this engine and transmission. Because wiggling it and jiggling it ain't doing shit. Big ass sledgehammer and a long ass screwdriver. That's the next two tools. This shit's getting real. Now the first thing you want to do is double check that you removed all the bolts and nuts from your transmission bell housing. Once you've double checked all that shit and you're sure you've removed everything, and if you have one of these clutch fork shafts, you definitely remove that fork shaft, go ahead and use this method. Now where I'm hitting is right behind the starter location, right up against the engine and the transmission bell housing. Screwdriver and your sledgehammer, give it a few whacks. This should separate this sucker. Alright, I'm going to show you from this angle. Maybe you can see a little better. Man, that sucker was seized on there. Once you see that crack developing, you can actually adjust the angle of the engine. That way you know it's aligned with the angle of the transmission. Because you need to have the engine and the transmission aligned on that input shaft plane so you can slide it off that input shaft. Basically just keep bashing it with a hammer and that flat blade screwdriver right in between the mating surfaces, and then work it with your hands to try to work it loose and slide that sucker back. As you can see, I have a solid inch now, which means that engine is completely separated from that transmission. Bell housing dowels have completely slid out. Okay, there's a close-up view of those dowels and that lower engine stud. Those dowels are what get seized up in the engine block. I think those dowels were really corroded, and that's what was holding the sucker in. So as soon as you get those dowels out, then that engine should be able to slide out. So we're ready now to back this engine out and slowly lift it out of the engine bay. Okay, now that the engine's free from that transmission, I'm going to slowly guide it out by cranking up on that hoist and slowly lifting this engine out so I don't crush anything on its way out of the engine bay. If you need to, you can adjust that engine stand by pushing it forward just slightly like I'm doing right now. And then just keep an eye on all four corners and get that engine out of the bay. And slowly crank it up. Engine's out of the car, and we are ready to put the sucker on the engine stand. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed the build series where I've walked through every single step that you need to do when you get ready to pull an engine out of a Subaru vehicle. This engine is a dual overhead cam turbo motor, but all the steps that I walked through in this build series will apply to naturally aspirated motors, 4-cylinder motors, turbocharged motors, or 6-cylinder motors. Most of the steps will apply to any Subaru vehicle. So regardless of what your build is, take a look at these videos and you should be able to pull your engine, no problem. Next step for me is going to be putting this sucker on the engine stand and then starting to pare it down so we can replace the head gaskets. That'll be a whole new build series I'm really excited to start, and I hope you guys will follow me while I go through that whole phase of the build. I'm Luke, this is the SubaruONLY show. Thank you so much for checking out the video, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please leave in the comments section. If you like the video, please go ahead and give it a like. Until next time, guys, I'm out of here. Later.